of, meditation, yoga, and things like that, including deep religious prayer. And I thought this was very interesting that there is a parallel benefit of praying as much as meditation or yoga or any of these combination of the three. And the study showed using MRIs that the person's gray matter in the brain. Welcome to Learn or Be Learned. We either learn from others or others learn from us. The former is able to help us become a better, faster you. Follow me weekly as I dig up stories like a true anthropologist would on one of the three series called Guest Conversations, Book Applications, or my Small Talk Explorations. I am your host, Shiva Danshekar, and let's talk. Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Learn or Be Learned. On this week's Small Talk series episode, we are going to dive into the literature behind meditation. So, the Harvard literature says that there are certain health effects and benefits of doing meditation. Alvin Powell wrote an article in Health and Medicine on the Harvard Gazette about science behind meditation. And he mentioned things like America's being heavily medicated for things, including mood instability and depression, and how mindfulness meditation might be able to help. He referred to another article, another Harvard study, called Clearing Your Mind Affects Your Genes and Can Lower Your Blood Pressure. And this article by Richard Knox states that Harvard scientists have come up with evidence that the mere act of clearing your mind for 15 minutes a day can actually alter how your genes operate. And a new study indicates that people who meditate over an 8-week period had striking changes in their expression of over 172 genes that regulate inflammation, circadian rhythms, glucose metabolism, and that in return was linked to meaningful decreases in their blood pressure and things like that, right? So I will say that something to note here is that the study was small. It did not include a comparison group of non-meditators, so this doesn't count as an absolute proof that meditation lowers blood pressure by altering gene expression, but there is research to suggest that this should be looked at further. And then in the 1970s, when transcendental meditation surged in popularity, Herbert Benson, a professor at Harvard Medical School, explored what they called the relaxation response, identifying it as a common functional attribute of, meditation, yoga, and things like that, including deep religious prayer. And I thought this was very interesting that there is a parallel benefit of praying as much as meditation or yoga or any of these combination of the three. And the study showed using MRIs that the person's gray matter in the brain, their prefrontal cortex, and their amygdala changed sizes, right? So what does this all mean? Well, gray matter is throughout the central nervous system, and it allows individuals to control movement, memory, emotions, etc. And the prefrontal cortex is a cortex in the brain, primarily in the front of the brain, and this controls and plays a central role in cognitive control functions such as, dopamine, attention, impulse inhibition, memory, and cognitive flexibility. And lastly, we mentioned the amygdala. The amygdala is a little part of the brain that processes fear and threat stimuli, right? So detection of threat and fear response, anger, things like that. So I looked into Sarah Lazar's TEDx Cambridge talk where she talked about how meditation can reshape our brains to look at this further. And she claimed that meditation can decrease stress, decrease mental instability, anxiety, depression, etc. There was reports of overall happiness or life satisfaction, quality of life. And this may be due to the gamma waves invoked from meditation, which is what I've seen from other books and readings and such. And lastly, she mentioned there may be a better overall focus and attention. This is involved with the prefrontal cortex. So she goes on to mention that it is known that habits are formed when an action is repeated and then the brain chemistry and structure is altered. This is referred to as neuroplasticity. And I saw an interesting talk with Joe Rogan and some guest, and he was saying that, as we grow older, our consciousness, our mind is like a hill with snow on it. And when it first snows, we've all seen this, whether it's pictures or in real life or whatnot. snow is very flat, right? It's very clear. There's no, bumps or ridges, and there's no like grooves and stuff, right? It's a very flat, soft surface that just, looks like a clear plain of snow everywhere. So that is how our consciousness is. But as we grow older and we have these thoughts and we start creating grooves in the snow as if you're sledding down the hill. So every time you have a thought and, it provokes an action and whatnot, think of it as a person going down a hill of the snow in a sled. And this can kind of be referred to, plasticity, right? So you keep having thoughts and habits are formed from your thoughts and actions, and you keep having more and more grooves as you go down the sled and down the hill. And before you know it, there is several grooves because you've gone down the hill several times. Well, sooner or later, when you go down the hill, no matter where you are, you're going to fall into one of those grooves. Whether you start in a plain area where there is no grooves and you fall down the hill, you often just fall into the groove that was already put in the previous path, meaning the grooves get deeper and deeper, which makes it even easier to get, sucked back into that specific thought process. And I thought this was interesting, right? And here we see Lazar talk about how habits are formed from actions and repeated actions and how this changes your brain chemistry and structure of your brain. And that is neuroplasticity. So this happens when you learn something new as well, which is why this podcast is all about learning and things like that, because I think, learning shouldn't stop after you're done with school. You should always keep learning things that you're interested in. And this week is about meditation. So, a small side fun fact. When you learn something new that sticks with you, you release dopamine. And this is actually kind of why TikTok can be addictive, especially on the personal growth or anything educational. It doesn't have to be educational in terms of school. It could even be, here's 5 life hacks for, cleaning your room easier or something like that, right? Anything that gets you to learn a single fact. And since TikToks are, like around 1-minute videos, you can kind of get that hit of dopamine within a minute. And then you swipe and you do it again, which is why it can be so addictive. Well, okay, tangent aside, Lazar tried to study on 2 groups that were demographically parallel, meaning similar variables to keep the comparisons accurate as possible. The big difference was one group meditated 30 to 40 minutes a day and the other group did not. They compared the results with an MRI machine, and there were several areas in the brain with significantly more gray matter than the control group and a shrunk amygdala. So what was interesting was her multivariate analysis afterwards, where she compared it against the ages of these groups and found that the prefrontal cortex's growth in gray matter was matched of those in their 50s to those in their 20s. So what does this mean? This would suggest that meditation may slow down or even reverse the cognitive aging process. So then some people were saying, these people already meditate, maybe there's other variables, maybe it's diet and all sorts of stuff, right? So then they took people that had never meditated instead of a group that had meditated versus not. And they took these people that had never meditated and did the same study over an 8-week period. So for people with depression and PTSD, there's often less gray matter in their hippocampus, right? And those who meditated had an increase of gray matter in this region specifically. And the hippocampus is a complex brain structure embedded into our temporal lobe. It has a major role in learning and memory. It is plastic and vulnerable, not plastic like, bottled plastic, but like it's plastic in terms of plasticity of the brain and is vulnerable structure that gets damaged by a variety of stimuli and emotion regulation. So the hippocampus is very important in emotional gauging. It's very important in learning and memory, and it can change, plasticity. It can change over time. So another section of the brain analyzed through the MRI machine was the temporal parietal conjunction. I know this sounds like a lot, but basically this is part of the brain that's involved in perspective talking and empathy and compassion. So the meditation group had an increase, again, in just 8 weeks, while the control group had a slightly overall decrease, interestingly enough. And lastly, we see that the amygdala, there was a decrease in gray matter. And this is actually a good thing because the region is related to fear and anger response, meaning the people reported being less stressed, more calm, and such. We see that there's an increase in cognitive function no matter the age. We see that there is emotional regulation, less stress, there's more calmness, there's better memory and attention, and there's often higher gamma waves in the brain when you meditate. So a lot of this is just linked to overall life satisfaction. Something really interesting was Lazar referred to a study done on rats where they put them through stressful responses for 10 days and then analyzed their brains. And they found that their amygdala grew, but 3 weeks later, just 3 weeks later, they measured their brain again, but after putting them back in a normal, happy, responsive environment. So they put them in a stressful response for 10 days and then analyzed their brain and then put them back into their normal environment for 3 weeks. And then they measured their brain again, and this is where it gets interesting. After putting them back in their normal response, analyzing their brain activity, the rat's amygdala size remained the same, meaning they were still acting and behaviorally inducing in stressful responses throughout their daily lives, even though their environment was much more calm and happy. That's kind of crazy because it shows that meditation can actually decrease gray matter size, and this doesn't entirely happen on its own accord, right? Just because you're no longer stressed, it's now gone down. So that's super interesting. And this kind of shows the power of meditation, right? And why this study is important is that the brain structure actually does not respond to the environment, but more so the reaction and relationship to their environment. Because the rats were still stressed after being put in a normal environment, and those human individuals that were mentioned in the study above that never meditated and did it for 8 weeks had a decrease in amygdala size, even though they still had to go to work, they still had stressful daily lives, nothing else changed. So it is very clear to see that meditation may improve all sorts of aspects to your life and quality of life. So I guess to wrap this up, I think it was really interesting to read some papers and articles and, some of the literature behind the science of meditation and see that there really is more power than what we believed, right? Maybe some people think it's gimmicky and whatnot, but I think there is a lot of power behind meditation, and I think it can be really beneficial to apply it to your life. And I really think you should give it a shot. There are many meditation apps like Headspace, Balance, or Calm on the App Store. Not really sure about Android, sorry guys. But to be quite honest, I think, in my opinion, just putting on some calming music on YouTube or whatever and meditating early morning or night when it is calm and quiet and no one is around is probably your best bet. Because if you do it midday or during the day, something about, for me at least, it's a lot more calm when it's night and it's either, dark and early in the morning and everyone's asleep, or it's later in the night, 8 p.m. or whatever, and it's dark again and you're very calm and quiet and alone. I think those are the best ways to do it because honestly, I don't think meditation is necessarily about clearing your mind from all thoughts, but more so recognizing them pass, kind of like wind against a tree's leaves, right? More so flowing with it rather than, trying to suppress it. And I think that's the key, is detaching yourself from your thoughts in meditation. And this is definitely a journey of learning, and meditation is a very umbrella term, kind of like exercise. There's a lot of different types. There's a lot of things you can do. So I definitely think you should look more into it and see what works for you and what you're interested in. But there is no doubt that meditation makes for a lot of genetic expression differences in your brain, including gray matter sizing and all sorts of stuff, right? So, and I can speak from personal experience that it definitely makes me more calm, definitely makes me more focused, and definitely I do feel a sense of happiness more so than when you're not meditating, probably due to the changes in gray matter in the brain. So I hope you guys like this episode. I'm thinking about making the small talk episodes a little bit more academic and literature and whatnot, and trying to just provide you value from things that I'm learning and seeing as, we're in the technological revolution, guys. So there's going to be a lot of changes in things that we learn, the science, medicine, everything, right? Tech. So it's really interesting to see, and I hope you guys enjoy this episode. I'd really appreciate if you guys could leave me a review on Apple or Spotify. I'm definitely working on making more Spotify video format podcasts, so if you listen on Spotify, stay tuned for that, and I really appreciate you guys for being there. I know it's been on and off about podcasts. Maybe I'll make an episode about, things that are happening in my life if that seems interesting at all, but I've been balancing a lot of things, so the podcast has been a little inconsistent, but I am working on it to bringing it back to consistency and growing my team. So I really appreciate you guys for listening, and I really love this community. It's growing. You guys are amazing. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much. And remember, guys, you either learn from or you're learned from.